The Mi-24 attack helicopter, or rotary wing aircraft as they say in the trade. It has its own niche in aviation history, one of the best helicopters there is. In more than 40 years of operations, it's proved itself time and again. Despite its longevity, the Mi-24 is still soldiering on, in service, worldwide. Mi-24, Film 1, The Warrior. The Mi-24 became the first Soviet special mission attack helicopter. It was the brainchild of the great helicopter designer Mikhail Leontievich Mil. These days, everybody knows that the attack helicopter is an essential protagonist on the battlefield. The Mi-24's jobs include the fire support of ground troops, detecting and destroying enemy armor, and even attacking enemy helicopters. But in the early 60s, when Mikhail Mil first took his idea for such an aircraft to the military, they were not impressed, to put it mildly. I was there when it happened in 1963. There was a big event at Khodenka airfield. Mil mentioned that he could design a combat helicopter. Khrushchev and Malinovsky and other bigwigs were there. There was an aggressive disagreement between Malinovsky, who was Minister of Defense, and his deputy Grechko. Grechko was very keen on the idea, but Malinovsky wasn't. He said, "I'll crush this bloody machine with a stick," and worse. There was much cursing and swearing. Nikita Khrushchev just looked at them and then told them to shut up. Nikita Khrushchev was known for catching people on the hop. He decided to hold his Politburo meeting inside the newest IL-62 airliner. They were due to discuss the next 5-year plan for Soviet aviation. But nobody wanted to hear about combat helicopter development. What nobody seemed to care about was that Mikhail Mil's team already had plenty of experience of arming the Mi-1 and Mi-4 with rockets. Previously, the Mi-1 had been unarmed and the Mi-4 had carried just one gun. In cooperation with the military, Mil's team had been experimenting with helicopter armament since the late 1950s. At that time, the first anti-tank guided missile systems were being produced by the Soviet Union, and missile launchers were mounted on various support platforms. The Mi-1 became the first Soviet aircraft with an anti-tank missile system called Falanga. Despite positive results in the armed helicopter test programs, none of the armed versions went into production. The military preferred traditional support for ground forces, tanks and fixed-wing attack aircraft. So, the Mi-4 remained the only armed helicopter. And there was a military transport version with a heavy machine gun in a nacelle under the nose as well. But the leading Western helicopter companies were already carrying missiles. At the 1965 Paris Air Show, Mikhail Mil got a good look at the new foreign helicopters, particularly the Belle Iroquois, generally known as the Huey. It had gone into operational service with the US Army 4 years earlier. With its 2-pilot crew, it could carry 7 battle-equipped soldiers. But there was also a fire support version of the Huey that carried a mounted small-caliber automatic weapon, as well as rocket launchers on either side of the fuselage. Bell and the US Army were also thinking about fitting anti-tank missiles. At that Paris Air Show, the Soviet helicopters went down a storm. But Mikhail Mil's enthusiasm was rather more restrained. In his personal diary, he wrote, "For helicopters in general, we're 3 or 4 years ahead of the competition. But as far as military rotary wing is concerned, ours are well behind aircraft like the Iroquois." In that same year, 1965, Mil managed to resume work on the armed versions of the Mi-1 and Mi-4. At the same time, tests were finished on the Mi-8T armament system. That was a new helicopter to replace the Mi-4. It carried bombs as well as 57mm rocket pods on fuselage racks. Two years later, the K-4V system was developed for the Mi-4 helicopter. It included 4 Phalange guided anti-tank missiles and 96 rockets in 6 pods. Or, instead of the pods, you could hang various bombs or incendiary tanks or even pods carrying guns. As well as that, there were pivot-mounted machine guns in the windows and doors. And in this configuration, the Mi-4 couldn't do any transport tasks because the armament fully used up the payload capacity. So, it was used for fire support only. 185 helicopters eventually got the K-4V system. The armed forces used them to learn how those sorts of weapon systems could be used in combat, and also for basic crew training, of course. In the mid-60s, the United States intervened in the war between North and South Vietnam. The American Army famously made much use of helicopters. Rotary wing significantly increased the mobility of the US combat forces. It allowed them to respond more quickly and to concentrate force in the right place. It was during the Vietnam War that the Americans used an attack helicopter for the first time. This was the Huey Cobra, developed from the original Huey Iroquois. The Cobra specialized in fire support for landing troops. It carried rockets and guns. It was compact and very maneuverable. Clearly, Mikhail Mil was keeping up to date with global helicopter development. Indeed, by the early 60s, he was already designing new armed helicopters. Historically, the mobility of ground troops has progressively improved with technological development. At the end of the First World War, horses were replaced by mechanical horsepower, and the army became motorized. The infantry began to use armored personnel carriers. Mil believed that the next step in increasing mobility should be airborne personnel carriers, or combat helicopters. At first, he drew a rather small, single-engined helicopter. But it could transport not just the weapon, the pilot and the operator, but also a group of soldiers. It was also in the 60s that the development of infantry combat vehicles began. They had complete weapon systems, unlike the unarmed vehicles and lightly armed infantry carriers. On the range in Alabino in the Soviet Union, the tests of the new BMP-1 were in full swing. The designers and engineers of the Mil Bureau came to check out the new military vehicle. Some of the helicopter designers came away with the idea of creating an airborne infantry combat vehicle. This helicopter would transport the infantry to the battlefield and also provide their fire support. At the time, there was nothing in the world like this. They were either assault helicopters or combat helicopters. Mikhail Mil decided that what was needed was a helicopter like a ground infantry combat vehicle. He privately called it VBMP. He shared his thoughts with us about the project and what he was doing in it. And since the work on Mi-24 had already begun, the military had to be convinced that they actually needed this machine. They needed to see that it was not like any other combat helicopter. In 1967, Mil managed to persuade Andrei Grechka, the first Deputy Minister of Defense, to convene a conference on combat and assault helicopters. As we heard earlier, Grechka had always been sympathetic to the idea of armed helicopters. He supported Michael Mil during the discussion of those ideas. I would say that after that meeting, the concept of a new helicopter was born. The Design Bureau made a convincing presentation of the new concept. Mil dealt with all the major issues in some detail. Andrei Grechka was so impressed that he even asked the chief designer to leave at least some problems for the military specialists. The reactions of the military were very different. Some were extremely negative. One such was the head of the main political directorate of the Soviet Army, General Alexei Ipishov. He actually said, "We have to put the chief designer in the helicopter and send him to war so he can find out what a nonsense he's offered." But Michael Mil knew what he was doing perfectly well. The concept of an armed helicopter wasn't anything new for Mil. He'd even developed the idea of armament for autogyros, the helicopter's predecessors. Before the war, he and his team had worked on the concept of fighting autogyros for the Red Army. There was one for artillery spotting and one for fighting. But the way things were at the time, it wasn't possible to build them. During the Second World War, Michael Mil had studied the controllability problems of the IL-2 fixed-wing attack aircraft. His studies became part of his candidate dissertation on the issues of fire support aircraft dynamics. This designer knew every aspect of attack aviation inside out. Mil always applied the utmost thoroughness to any problem he had to solve. In spite of the differing views for and against the combat helicopter, the Mil Design Bureau was contracted to prepare the technical design for just such a helicopter. The Kamov Design Bureau also got the same contract. At the Mil Bureau, they quickly came up with two new designs. The first was a 7-ton helicopter with a single advanced engine, and the second was half as big again, a 10.5-ton twin-engine helicopter. They built mock-ups. The Kamov Design Bureau had a cheaper solution. They decided to upgrade an armed version of their ship-based Ka-25 helicopter that was already widely in use by the Navy. The Ukhtomsky helicopter plant had been involved for some time with developing armament systems for the Ka-25, including air-to-surface missiles. There was some support amongst the military for the Kamov offer. The final decision went in favor of the twin-engined Mil helicopter. The customer accepted Mil's preliminary design, but they wanted the GSH-23 gun replaced with a quick-firing heavy machine gun. They also wanted the main anti-tank weapon to be the Sturm system with a supersonic missile and a semi-automatic control system. The helicopter also got new aiming and navigation systems, and it was designated V-24. Conceptual design development began in May 1968. Michael Mil was busy with other projects, but he personally oversaw the development of the new machine. The organization of the whole project fell to his deputy Vyacheslav Kuznetsov. He was one of the most experienced helicopter designers in the Soviet Union, and he'd worked with Mil since before the war. In February 1969, the Governmental Commission approved the combat helicopter mock-up. The first prototype was designed in June. V-24 development went on apace, largely because of Mil's insistence that complex and critical components of the Mi-8 and Mi-14 helicopters should form the basis of the V-24 systems. Amongst those components were the engines, the rotor hub and swashplate, the tail rotor, and some of the transmission. A new TV3117 two-shaft turbine engine designed by Sergei Izotov was one of the best available. It compared well with foreign engines. In the summer of 1969, the Minister of the Aviation Industry, Petr Demyentyev, called a progress meeting for the new helicopter development. Michael Mil and some of his design bureau colleagues were present. The meeting was held in the minister's office. Only senior ministry people and a few of us from the companies were invited. Mil asked me to brief the meeting. I put up a poster diagram, that was all there was for briefings, and started. As I spoke, I was watching the minister, Petr Demyentiev. He was gradually turning purple with rage. After probably 10 minutes, he couldn't take any more. He blew up and he launched a tirade of abuse at me and Michael Mil. "What is this?" he shouted. It turned out that his frustration was because of the Sukhoi Design Bureau. They were developing a new system for their Su-24 aircraft called Puma. Our system looked pretty much the same. "So how many Pumas are you going to offer me?" he shouted. "Is it one more Puma or what?" The Puma electronic system had been developed for the Su-24 tactical bomber. It involved an awful lot of suppliers. It was a constant headache for the minister, Petr Demyentiev. Yes, and he said, "Stop playing the fool. There are all sorts of aircraft components available, so just get hold of them and make them work. There's the ASP-17 aircraft sight, a tank-aiming device for the amphibious armored scout car for rocket guidance and a rangefinder. Let the designers from Krasnogorsk fiddle about with all those components. Get hold of them all, put them together, and that's it. And what about a turret design? Well, there's the Tu-16 plane. Why not take that turret and the KPS-53 sighting station? Just install all these things." So, eventually, that whole meeting led to a long series of problems because instead of all the systems being harmonized, we ended up with disparate individual elements that were just not compatible. All the various suppliers went off in different directions. Nobody wanted to cooperate. There was no design leader for the aircraft systems as a whole. The factory test program began with tethered hops. Then on September the 19th, the new helicopter made its maiden flight. The test pilot was Yerman Alfierov. It had become traditional for Michael Mil always to watch the first flight, but he was not there for subsequent flights. The long strain had badly damaged his health. About 4 months after that first flight of the V-24, Michael Mil died. He was just 60. The development of the new helicopter was carried on by Michael Mil's colleagues. The bureau was now headed by the man who'd been deputy general designer, Marat Tishenko. The first 2 prototypes of the V-24 were built at the Moscow helicopter plant, and they were used for flight testing. After that, there were another 10 prototypes. 5 were built at the Moscow plant, the rest at the Progress Arsenyev aviation plant. Flight testing of the first prototypes began in June 1970 and took 18 months. The tests were intensive. They pretty much confirmed preliminary calculations. Problems were successfully solved. They mostly related to things like the strength of the fuselage, some unacceptable vibrations, and the helicopter's service life. That said, there were several issues that called for significant changes to the helicopter design. To improve the lateral stability at high speeds, they decided to give the wing an anhedral rather than having it straight. The Mi-24 had come into being much earlier than the armament system for which it was designed. That Sturm system and the quick-firing gun weren't ready yet, so the first prototypes of the combat helicopter had the K-4B armament system. As we've mentioned, that system had proved itself in the armed versions of Mi-4 and Mi-8 helicopters. They installed a single-barreled, manually controlled machine gun in the nose of the Mi-24 and Falanga anti-tank missile launchers on frames alongside the fuselage. But tests showed that the rockets would fly erratically and could even hit the fuselage. The frames were no good. Vertical pylons with guide rails for the anti-tank missiles were added on the wingtips instead. And that was how the helicopter got its distinctive silhouette. Next, the designers added unguided missiles, guns, grenade launchers, napalm tanks, and the rest. And of course, all of that needed to be tested. Another improvement during the tests was the further development of the engines, but the new versions had a lifetime of not much more than 2 hours. When missile launch tests and gun firing took place, the engineers had to be very careful with the engine handling. When the new engines were first installed, everything you could imagine went wrong. They were unresponsive, or they surged, or they had all sorts of other problems. The engine designers had more trouble than you could imagine. But eventually, the job did get done. As they developed the new sighting and gunnery system, the designers realized that the V-24 cockpit did not have room for the planned Raduga F system. That's what would have controlled the semi-automatic anti-tank missiles. And also the quick-firing machine gun. So the Design Bureau decided to enlarge the front cockpit in the two prototypes. And they also put in the new wing. So it was the end of 1970 before the first proper version of V-24 was developed. Production started at the Soviet Aviation plant. Production aircraft all had the bigger cockpit and the anhedral wings. Also, the military had asked that the weapons system operator's position should have a full set of controls, so the operator could fly the helicopter if the pilot were injured. The production helicopter received the new designation Mi-24A. The next year, with manufacturer's flight tests complete, the modified aircraft was officially approved for Air Force trials. I personally got acquainted with the Mi-24 helicopter in 1972 at the Sborkina station at Brode Airfield. It was love at first sight. The Mi-24A may have been a bit homely with its square cockpit, but it was a real combat helicopter. And all the lieutenants on the squadron fell in love with this helicopter straight away, just because it was a combat helicopter. We liked the built-in armament system. The helicopter performance was great. Those old piston engines had gone, and the new gas turbines produced enormous power. The Mi-24A helicopters were made at the Arsenyev plant for 5 years, about 250 of them in total. Once they were in service and on operations, there was plenty more development and updating, and their reliability and efficiency improved. Shortly after the Mi-24A went into mass production, the Mil Bureau began improving the armament system. A new, experimentally modified helicopter version was designated Mi-24B. It had a mobile turret with a quick-firing Yakushov-Borzova quadruple machine gun. It boasted an analog computer which automatically corrected the firing to compensate for flight conditions. Plus, it had the Falanga P anti-tank missile system with semi-automatic control. All of that increased the overall efficiency of the aircraft some 3 to 4 times. During gunfiring, the gyro-stabilized guidance gizmo allowed the helicopter to maneuver up to 60 degrees off its heading. That was a big improvement in the combat effectiveness of the helicopter. The Mi-24B prototype successfully passed the first stage of their flight tests. But then, all development stopped. it is because the military had found a problem with the Mi-24A. The view from its bigger cockpit was not good enough. Also, both pilots were in one cockpit, not a good idea for an attack helicopter. They designed a completely new nose at the beginning of 1971. Pilot and weapon systems operator sat at different levels in tandem. They each had a narrow, isolated and heavily protected cockpit with an armoured windscreen. And this arrangement solved other problems. The Raduga F system could achieve the wide angle of view necessary for its optical device. And there was room for command and control radio antenna. The military quite often complained that in some flight conditions, the Mi-24's directional control wasn't all that it might be. That problem was solved by moving the tail rotor from the right-hand side to the left and changing the direction of its rotation. And that apparently enabled it to exert more power, which fixed the control problem. As for the weaponry, as well as the rapid-fire machine guns, the Sturm supersonic guided anti-tank system was fitted. But the development of that caused some delay. In 1973, an intermediate version of the helicopter with the integrated Phalange system went into production, designated Mi-24D. In addition to the Arsenyev plant, the Rostov helicopter plant also became involved in mass production. The tests of the long-awaited anti-tank Sturm system with its supersonic missiles were complete by November 1975. At last, the helicopter now met the initial requirements of its customer. This was what the military wanted all along. The helicopter's development had actually taken nearly 8 years, and most of that time had been spent on the design and development of the sighting and armament systems. The new version was to be designated Mi-24V. Meanwhile, on the 29th of March 1976, a government statement recorded the official entry into service of the Mi-24D and Mi-24V. That made about 400 of the Mi-24 in different versions in service at that stage. The Mi-24 had quickly become popular with the military. In fact, combat army aviation had been born. New principles of its application had been created. The most important thing at that time was that the helicopter had successfully gone through its upgrades. We'd had no time to sit back while those developments were going on. A, then B, then P, and VP. And each version brought something new that forced us all to relearn and standardize. Different navigation systems, new armament systems, they all changed so quickly. And the result was that, having gone into service in Army aviation in such numbers, the Mi-24 was simply the best. Aircrew didn't take long to master the new helicopters. Special training versions came into service so that crews could convert onto the type. But the technical training for new pilots was delivered on operational combat units or in special combat training centers. The Mi-24 had 3 different roles in the Soviet Army. As a combat helicopter, it had an anti-tank role, it provided fire support for the army, and it carried out tactical assault with pinpoint accuracy against personnel and strong points. In its transport role, it could land troops almost anywhere, resupply advanced forces, or more generally transport forces and their freight. As a medical evacuation helicopter, it would quickly transport wounded personnel. Mi-24V multi-role attack helicopter. Main rotor diameter 17.3 meters. Fuselage length 17.5 meters. Maximum takeoff weight 11,500 kilograms. Maximum loading capacity 2,400 kilograms. Power plant, 2 gas turbine engines with 2,225 horsepower each. Crew, 3 people. Maximum speed, 320 kilometers per hour. Range, 595 kilometers. Armament, Yak B 12.7mm quadruple machine gun. Rockets, bombs, Sturm anti-tank missile system. The helicopter was fast and maneuverable. In 1975, a female crew, pilot Galina Rastahuyeva and navigator Lyudmila Polyanskia, set several world speed and time-to-height records in one flight in the light version of the helicopter. Because of operational security, the record helicopter was designated A-10, and the pilots were photographed in the cockpit of an Mi-8. Also in 1975, test pilot Hurricane Karpetyan flew the helicopter to an absolute world speed record for helicopters of 368.4 kilometers per hour. That record was unsurpassed for more than 10 years. The helicopter design was technologically very well thought out. Its progress into mass production had gone more or less without a hitch. And airframes from the Rostov helicopter plant were the ones that went for export. The Mi-24 was designed to be simple to assemble. Let me explain a bit. As one example, the tail boom of this aircraft, the bit behind the cabin, is joined to the tail pylon, where the tail rotor is, by a universal connector. So that tail boom can be made separately, with some preliminary installation bits inside. So the whole helicopter can be supplied in parts, in special containers, which actually don't look like a helicopter at all. You can take delivery of these big boxes by train, by air, any way you want. People wouldn't guess that inside these containers there's a combat helicopter. It's easy to assemble, either in series mass production in a factory, or it could even be after you've delivered the helicopter in its boxes right to the airfield. The Mi-24 had many design similarities to the Mi-8 and the amphibious Mi-14 helicopter. The engine and the rotor system were almost identical. It made for easy access maintenance, especially in the field. As with the Mi-8, you actually didn't need any ladders. The engine cowlings opened manually and turned into convenient servicing platforms, and even normally hard-to-access areas could be easily reached. Unlike the Mi-8, though, the Mi-24 had a wide tail boom, which ended in a large fin. At maximum speed, that fin created 2/3 of the side-to-side force that you need to balance the torque of the main rotor. And the wing on this helicopter helped to reduce the load on the main rotor, allowing that to maximize its service life. And it wasn't only aerodynamics that improved the Mi-24's speed, but also the retractable undercarriage. In fact, it became the first Soviet helicopter with retractable gear. The Mi-24 fuel system consisted of 5 self-sealing tanks with a total capacity of 2,125 litres. If one of the tanks got damaged, the fuel system could still function. For ferry flights, you could put 2 additional metal tanks inside the cargo compartment. One of the unusual things about the Mi-24 is that the main rotor, and hence the engines, tilt 2.5 degrees to the right. And what that does is to significantly improve the accuracy of fixed weapons. The reason for this is that the helicopter often hovers with a slight bank, or it flies with a small amount of side slip. So, with this rotor and engine tilt, the roll and side slip of the helicopter are reduced to a minimum. Survivability is a vital attribute for a combat helicopter. So, the Mi-24's structural components, equipment and crew seats are all armour protected. Some major systems are duplicated. To protect against radiation and chemical contamination, the cockpit is pressurized with a slight overpressure, and the inlet air is purified and conditioned. The combination of the onboard flight and navigation systems and specialist electronic equipment provides flight stabilization, and that takes some load off the pilot and means that the helicopter can fly day and night missions in any weather. It can hover under automatic control. As well as the main navigation equipment, there was also a Doppler radar. Over featureless terrain, it would show the helicopter's location on a special display. But most of the time, pilots relied on their flying skills, a map, a pencil, and a ruler. By the end of the 70s, Soviet pilots were taking full advantage of the Mi-24's systems. New tactics for cooperation with ground forces were developed. As with all military service, the advantages and the disadvantages of the new helicopter became clear. The designers developed new ways to increase the helicopter's efficiency. During this time, the Mi-24 took part in every Army exercise. These exercises proved the Mi-24 attack helicopter. It was a huge support for the Army. That was, after all, its main role, and it did play that role so well. It was exactly what the Army wanted and what it needed. The ground troops were happy that the Mi-24 was always there to help. But these were only exercises. Soon, the Mi-24 helicopter would prove itself in real combat.